Just, just sit so that for the chat. Sit for the chat. No, I know chat is there, but okay. I think we can begin. We can start. Right. So I welcome you all to this Cure in Science talk. Now, I hope I don't have to explain to everyone in the audience and to everyone who is present online with us that please be civil and any kind of abuse or derogatory language, you will be kicked out of this event. I just want to let everyone know of that. Um, so, this is Cure in Science talk series, something that Science Club had started, and this is. I would also like to tell Sayantan that this is actually you're the first speaker in this. We have more speakers from different parts, aspects of science community who will be sharing their experience, and it would happen towards the end of the month from now on. So, and let's hope we can keep this going for many months, but let's see how long we can go. So, okay, our speaker for today, Sayantan Datta. I think most of you might already know them. So, they are a queer trans science journalist who writes at intersections of science, gender, sexuality, health, and caste. They are faculty at the Center for Writing and Pedagogy, Krea University, and a member of lifeofscience.com, a feminist multimedia science collective. Over to you, Sayantan.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. It's always great to thank you that speakers like Isa which bring together scientific and scientific. So I'm going to share my screen that's visible, and so this talk is for all of you. So there's
Sayantan?
sorry, yeah.
I think you're breaking up a little bit. Can you just?
Is this better? Am I clear?
Yeah, actually, let us also just. I think. Is this a speaker problem or is it internet problem?
I think internet.
Internet. Okay. Just check your mic if it's fine.
Okay. I don't know. Is everybody else able to hear me?
We can't hear it at all.
It's not a speaker problem. He's breaking on Meet also.
We can't hear anything.
You can't hear me, is it? We can hear you, Sayantan.
Yeah. Okay. Now we can hear. Okay. Okay. It's fine. It's fine. I think it's fine.
Okay. I hope these technical interruptions will not stop us going ahead. Can I request that the Science Club Hall mute themselves, because I think there's some background that's coming. So if you don't mind, just mute your computer. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. What I was trying to say is that there's no reason to hold back your questions if there are any as I'm speaking. So please feel free to intervene and interject as and when you find appropriate. But what I do want to talk about today is to, of course, use the Pride Month as a context to talk about the lives of queer and trans individuals in science institutions, but also the institution of science as a whole. But the larger point that I'm going to try to make is that we are currently pursuing a heavily depoliticized and uncritical form of science education, and it'll be great if we could put the political back in science. And the reason why I want to sort of take us there is because I think there's enough evidence for us to believe and understand that science is political. It's political in its roots, it's political in its nature, it's political in its culture. And there's a constant attempt that we've been seeing to depoliticize science and science education. And that's where I'm going to begin today by talking about science and the ethics of curiosity. And curiosity is interesting for us to start thinking about, because curiosity is thought to be one of the fundamental and foundational um, psychological states required for somebody to do science. But the other thing that curiosity lets people do is, especially scientists do, is sort of be devoid of ethical concerns, where scientists can say that their investigations and their probings um, do not need as much of an ethical sort of jurisdiction, because they are doing it from a space of innocent curiosity. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the argument that, science is like a knife, and knife can be used to cut butter, or a knife can be used to stab people. And oftentimes when ethical problems have been pointed out in the sciences, people have said that, well, science is like that knife. You can use it to do great things for humanity, but you can also use it to, make that atom bomb that's going to blow millions of people off the face of this earth in a jiffy. So we want to start thinking about curiosity from that example. And one big fundamental problem to the knife argument, what we're calling the knife argument, is that science is not just a mere description of the natural world, right? So a scientist, and all of you who are sitting there, are not, as scientists, are not just describing natural processes, but also intervening into natural processes. And that's something that science does all the time, both at basic and applied science levels. And then there are more easier to understand ethics of curiosity, ethical problems with sort of this innocent approach to curiosity, which is that curiosity is often at loggerheads with the privacy of an individual. So I might be very curious about how a group of people, or how organisms do something, but I might be inadvertently harping on their right to privacy. And more importantly, one needs to understand that any research process cannot be innocent. And that's because of the unequal power dynamic that's created between the researcher and the researched, the knower and the known. And science is one of the disciplines that constructs this binary, this distinction really clearly, where it says that there's a researcher who's sort of detached and disinterested in sort of the internal workings of the system that it is looking at. And the researched, the known, is sort of located there. And this gives the scientist sort of the ability to evade ethical concerns and extract knowledge and sense out of the researched. And you see this power hierarchy and the violence, the possibility of violence that any kind of science research can inflict in the kind of terms that are used as we think about research. So, you're excavating data, you're mining data, you're extracting information. All of these terms are borrowed from heavily violent, heavily masculine processes. So there's a certain politics, and when we say politics at this moment, what we are talking about is understanding power relations between certain categories. There's certain politics to the act of doing science itself, to how science is found, to the foundations of science in several ways. And then when one looks at the culture of science, which is how science is done and who does this science, you see inequalities, gross inequalities that are evident right away. So on the left, what you see is graphs from aggregate data that BiasWatch India has been collating for several years now, where what they've been doing is they've been looking at the number of women and men faculty in Indian science institutions, and they've been putting together these numbers to think about the gender gap. And we see that the gender gap is really jarring. The aggregate number of percentage of women faculty in Indian science institutions appears to be something around 14%. The highest representation of women faculty is in the field of biology, and that is around 25%. And then as you go down the list that I've put there, so by the time you reach something like engineering, you've already reached something like 9%. So only 9% of all engineering faculty in Indian science institutions are women. And something that becomes very clear as you go through this graph is that there are certain sciences which have more representation of women, Often these sciences are also which have been called quote unquote feminine sciences. Soft sciences, so for example, biology, earth sciences, they've all been boxed together into this category of soft science. And then you have something like physics and engineering, which is sort of this hard science. And that doesn't hold true always, but you do see that distinction coming across as one puts together this list. Now, gender is, of course, not the only axis through which inequalities in sciences progress. So for example, in 2010, the Indian Academy of Sciences and the National Institute of Advanced Studies collaborated to produce this Women in Science report. This is a 2010 report. And the graph that you see on the right is the caste representation of women in research. So these are women who are in science institutions doing research, active research after their doctoral degree. So these are either assistant professors, associate professors, or professors. And you see that of the several people, of the large number of people, more than 250 people that they collated responses from, 80.4% of them come from general castes, which would be upper caste backgrounds. And as you go down the caste hierarchy, the representation of women from these backgrounds keeps on decreasing. And by the time you've reached scheduled tribes, I mean, at the time that this report was published, they literally had response from just one scheduled tribe faculty. And this is a very jarring number. We need to sit and be very uncomfortable with these numbers because these numbers have not changed since 2010. So this is much more recent data from Ankur Paliwal's Undark report called Dalit Scientists Face Barriers in India's Top Science Institutions, where if one were to look at, so different colors, so from the left to right, from yellow to purple, you have doctoral, so everything that sort of clumps together, undergrad, postgrad, and doctoral students, and then you have assistant professor, associate professor, and professor numbers from these levels. And when you see what's happening here, you see that the aggregate itself, so number of Dalit people, people coming from marginalized caste backgrounds are already really less, in fact, less than 25% in science institutions. But what is also interesting is if you were to look at how the numbers are changing as one moves across this hierarchy, so from undergrad, postgrad, doctoral levels to professor positions, you see that as you move up the academic ladder, the number of Savarna people, upper caste people increases, while the number of people from marginalized caste background steadily decreases. And by the time you've reached a professorial position, our upper caste people are almost at 100%, while Dalit Bahujan Adivasi people are almost touching the baseline. So, and then of course, Rennie Thomas has also shown that this is not just a question of numbers and who people are, but culture of institutions themselves show us that science institutions are incredibly casteist, and caste is one of the foundational ways in which science institutions are constructed. And so Rennie Thomas and Ajanta Subramaniam are two ethnographers who've done work in two different institutions in South India and have shown us very interesting ethnographic data about how caste functions in science institutions. And what I've just done is I've put together two ways that I found interesting, but Rennie, who's here, has written an entire book about this, and I strongly suggest that all of you go and have a look at that book. It's fairly simple to read, and it's an extremely insightful read into the many workings of Indian science institutions. So for example, one idea is of vegetarianism and how vegetarianism functions in Indian science institutions, and these are all elite Indian science institutions. So Ajanta did it in IIT Madras, for example. And you see that there are separate wash basins, separate entrances, separate messes even, where people have veg and non-veg food. And what Thomas's ethnography shows us is how there's a caste distinction that happens through this vegetarianism, where people from marginalized caste backgrounds go and have food at a certain mess, and people from upper caste backgrounds go and have food at a certain mess, and these two messes are different. But also then how is the desire to do science and the ability to do science, what upper caste individuals have been calling the merit argument for a very long time, how that is constructed. And one of the ways that's constructed is through Brahminism, where we see upper caste scientists, and the part in blue is a quote borrowed from Rennie's ethnography interview with an upper caste scientist, where it appears that Brahmins in science institutions are of the opinion that they are more passionate about learning and that they have some kind of natural tendency to do sciences, which doesn't hold true for people who are coming from marginalized caste backgrounds. And the way this has been constructed is really interesting. So you see something like, these guys are not interested to waste time like us, and the waste is in inverted commas. They think it is better to go for a technical or business education so that they would get immediate benefit. Science and research will not have an immediate effect. It takes time to get benefits. The most important thing one ought to have while pursuing research is patience, which we don't find among these groups. And this is, it's really unfortunate that one can say such statements without critically looking at what patience is and who has the privilege to be patient in science institutions, and also to sort of think about whether money making and doing science are really as detached from each other as one would imagine them to be. But the point of showing this is to say that there are several levels in which inequalities in the sciences are being constructed, and that is at the level of the nature of science, through questions of, through sort of, like innocent curiosity, which we know now is not innocent, and then questions of access, representation, architecture, food, etc. So everything about science in a science institution has a high possibility of being constructed around social inequalities. That is not really surprising for us, because science is born out of social realities and is very well located in society. So the point being to say that science is political, and it is this political nature of science that we need to recognize. So I did some work in 2020 when I was looking at transgender persons in the Indian science ecosystem, and I was trying to understand why are there so few transgender, gender non-conforming, and gender non-binary persons in the Indian science ecosystem. And this was despite 2014 NALSA versus Union of India judgment saying that transgender, gender non-conforming, and gender non-binary people should have access to education, and the government and institutions should be working towards affirmative action that brings more trans GNC and GNB people in the educational institutions. And so this was 6 years after the NALSA judgment. The numbers were still very bleak. So I decided to understand what's going on. And what I did is I started with surveys to collect some large scale data, and then moved on to do qualitative interviews to look at what's happening. And a couple of things came up, which is that science institutions are constructed in a very gendered fashion. So you have gender that marks sort of every architectural and infrastructural space in a science institution. So be it hostels, washrooms, sitting areas, laboratory spaces, all of them sort of automatically get constructed in gendered fashion, and this gender is often approached as a binary, so where there are male and female binaries at work. And as a result of that, there's a hampered mobility in an axis of campus spaces by transgender non-conforming and gender non-binary persons. And of course, there's a question of harassment and abuse that trans individuals often face. And this harassment and abuse can be of both overt and covert nature, of both sexual and non-sexual nature. And all of this sort of comes together to cause a decline in mental health of trans persons in the Indian science ecosystem. I've put two quotes from my interlocutors, from my respondents at the bottom of the slide, where what they are saying is that the fact that there's such a poor representation of LGBTQIA plus individuals in STEM makes LGBTQIA plus people willing to get into the sciences believe that it's difficult for people who are gender and sexual minorities to survive and thrive in this area. And then there's also a question of the classroom space, where curriculum, so syllabus and curriculum itself is prejudiced and unnuanced, and the faculty composition that enters this classroom space is also heavily it's a cis Brahmin heterosexual man who's often present in these spaces as a faculty, which comes together to make the space more and more exclusive and more excluding as time progresses. In fact, when I asked my respondents if their mental health has been affected because they are queer trans in STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and medicine, 38% of them said yes, and about 38% of them said maybe. And if you were to put these together, then you know that this is a fairly large number. And this is this does make us feel like, how is it that we've been able to maintain this value neutral image of science, where we've been able to say that science is one of those disciplines where who you are and where you come from does not matter, as long as you're good with your experiments and your field work, and as long as you are sort of interested in the work that you're doing, you should be able to do good science. But it's clear from all the discussion that we've had till now that there are certain inequalities in science. There are clear power hierarchies that we've been able to map out, and therefore there's a certain politics to science. Science is not apolitical at all. And this I want to use to sort of start talking about the fact that that there's a certain politics to the history of modern science itself. And this is a politics that is often not taught in classroom, but should be. So for example, and this politics becomes very interesting for us to think about, especially when we look at gender and sexuality, because modern science has had a huge role to play in how gender and sexuality have been constructed um, in the larger civil society. So for example, Michel Foucault has written about the science of sexuality, scientia sexualis, that sort of comes in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And very interestingly, what Foucault shows us through a historiography is that what's happening then is that the science of psychiatry is overshadowing, is replacing the confessional authority of the church. So, I'm sure all of you know that in Christian traditions, there's this idea of confession where people go to the father of a church and then sort of confess their sins, and they are given some kind of penance to perform. And what Foucault is showing us is that it is in the 18th century, what's happening is the psychiatrist is replacing this confessional authority of the church, where psychiatry is sort of hitting the Catholic Church head on and saying that what you're doing is superstition, what you're doing is oppression, and here's the science of psychiatry, which is supposed to rescue everybody from the oppression meted out by the Catholic Church. Now, this is interesting, A, because you must recognize that then one must see a power game that the science of psychiatry is very well a part of. But what is also interesting is what is the population that these psychiatrists are working with. So what you're looking at is a painting by Tony Robert Fleury about how the French psychiatrist Philippe Pinel is releasing quote unquote lunatics from their chains at the Salpêtrière asylum in Paris. So what Philippe Pinel is doing is that, so what used to happen was women who were particularly coming from marginalized backgrounds, so often sex workers, queer women, and remember that this marginalization is being constructed through sex and sexuality. So female sex workers and queer women and people with other mental health conditions were being sort of put in this asylum, locked up, chained, and going through various kinds of physical, sexual, and mental violence that one can imagine. So Pinel sort of walks in and Pinel liberates these women, and that's the image that you're saying, that they're being unchained in there. But what Foucault tells us is that this is also this is liberatory, and one cannot deny that. But in the liberation that's happening, what's also happening is that a power equation is being established. So A, the psychiatrist is saying that now it's my turn to listen to what you have to say, and you should come and tell me everything about you, right from what you eat, what you drink, to what you think about sex and what are your fantasies and your dreams and your wildest imaginations. So there is this distinction between the knower and the known that's being created. But what's also happening is that the psychiatrist is telling you that you cannot make sense of your experience. You require me, this scientist figure, to make sense of your experiences for you. And the sense that I make of your experience is the actual truth. And you cannot make better sense of your experience than I can. So setting this power equation out clearly, setting this distinction out clearly has been very critical to construction of what Foucault has called a natural sex, which is the cisgender, heteronormative, compulsive heterosexuality. The other part of how sexuality gets constructed through means of science has been traced by several scholars from the sort of rise of Darwinism. So what Charles Darwin is saying is that all species on Earth are in competition with each other because natural resources are limited, and species that are reproductively fit. And what reproductive fitness means is that you must be able to bear more and more progeny that then make more and more progeny. So because reproductive fitness is a crucial condition, according to Darwin, for species to survive, then what then Darwinism becomes a tool is to say that, okay, if you're not a part of this heterosexuality game, if you're not a part of compulsive heterosexuality, then you must be abnormal. You must be an aberration, a deviant that nature did not want. Because, well, Darwin has told us that nature is about compulsive heterosexuality. So through these two mechanisms, which is the rise of sexuality science, the science of sexuality in the West, and the rise of compulsive heterosexuality meted out through the language of Darwinism, they're coming together to tell us that a certain group of individuals, anybody who does not participate, and this is not just about queer and trans people, but anybody who does not participate in a very normative, heterosexual, progeny-oriented sexual practice is deviant and has to be necessarily eliminated because nature wanted them eliminated. And this then sort of comes down in the 20th century, particularly, to how science starts investigating, interacting with, and intervening into queer lives. So, for example, in the 1980, much before that, Sigmund Freud had given this sort of profound statement, which I'm sure we can't agree with anymore. But Freud had said that the anatomy, so my very biological being, is what my destiny is. So the anatomy is the Schicksal, is what Freud says. And Freud's statement influenced a lot of neuroscientists to start looking for anatomical basis for sexuality. And one of the earliest studies in this regards was done by Hoffman and Schwab in 1984, when what they did is that they sort of did a post-mortem study. So they took out brains from homosexual individuals who had died of AIDS and heterosexual individuals who had died of AIDS, and the reference group being people who had not died of AIDS but had died of other causes. And then they sort of started looking for, measuring sizes of parts of the brain. And Hoffman and Schwab said that the suprachiasmatic nucleus of homosexual individuals who died of AIDS was much larger than the reference group and the heterosexual individuals who died of AIDS. All of these studies were done on men alone. So there was no female subject per se that Hoffman and Schwab looked at. And soon after 1984, in 1991, Simone Lavey's very classic study, it was published in Nature, came out, where Lavey did something very similar, looked at female who died of female brains, male brains, and homosexual men who died of AIDS. He again looked at the size of parts of their brain and found out that one of the interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus. So in the brain, you have a region called the hypothalamus. It has an anterior and a posterior part. So the anterior hypothalamus has these small clusters of neurons which are called nuclei, and there are 4 such nuclei that Laue identified. The interstitial nuclei of anterior hypothalamus 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when Laue started measuring the sizes of these nuclei across the 3 population groups that he had identified, he found something interesting, which is that the size of ENA3, which is the interstitial nucleus of anterior hypothalamus 3, had something interesting to say, which is that heterosexual males had on an average, a larger uh, size of ENA3 as compared to female and homosexual male brains. But more importantly, what Laue also said is that the brain of homosexual individuals, homosexual males, seems to then follow anatomical structures that are similar to females. Now, of course, this study ruffled a lot of feathers, and everybody thought that, okay, we've finally found the anatomical basis of sexuality. And everybody, it became a big thing at one point of time, and Laue got his tenure and became a big faculty at one point of time. But there have been 2 lines of critique to these lines of research, a lot of which has come from this feminist scholar, Anne Foster Sterling, where she's pointed out that at the time that this study was being conducted, the tools of measurement that one could use, so that which would involve staining the particular nuclei and then measuring the brain sizes, the tools weren't good enough because these nuclei are really tiny. And if you were to go back and look at Laue's original data, what you see is just spots on a white background. And there's a high possibility that there's been either a misidentification of the nucleus or wrong measurements of these nuclei, or several others. So basically, one could not have clearly ascertained the measurement of these nuclei. But more importantly, what we see right from the figure that Laue has made, that there are a group of individuals, female individuals, who have large ENA3. There are heterosexual males who have small ENA3, and there are homosexual males who have large ENA3. So the kind of approach that Laue took to sort of just look at the averages is actually a wrong approach to take, because then you're leaving out these significant number of individuals who do not fit into Laue's imagination of the ENA3. And of course, anatomy is not the only way that some of this has been studied. And one big way that this has been studied is through neurogenetics. Some of you might already be aware that Seymour Benzer is regarded as the father of neurogenetics. He was a fruit fly biologist who got very intrigued. Allegedly, he got very intrigued by the different personalities that his 2 daughters had while growing up in the same household, and thus wanted to investigate whether behavior is coded genetically and whether it is coded in the brain and therefore genetically. And when I first encountered this as a budding fruit fly biologist, as a budding neurogeneticist during my PhD, this came across as a little shocking to me, because as far as I understand human behavior, everybody seems to have a different personality. And I and my sister have very different personalities. We've grown up in the same household. So for me, it was really interesting that this could come across as something that's off to Benzer. Like, how did this happen appears to be a question that Benzer is harping on, when this appears to be the most normal observation when one looks at the natural world. But more importantly, what's interesting is, what did this kind of research lead scientists to do with sexuality? And 1952, this is before Benzer started neurogenetics, there was just one study by Franz Kollmann where they looked at homosexuality in monozygotic twins. So I'm sure all of you know that twins can be either monozygotic or fraternal. So monozygotic twins would mean that that both the twins have the same basic gene code, and fraternal would mean that they've arisen from sort of 2 different embryos, 2 different zygotes. Therefore, there would be minor variations in their genetic composition. Now, when one looked at so what Coleman was doing is Coleman was looking at whether there's a concomitance of homosexuality in these monozygotic twins. So if one twin is homosexual, what is the probability that the other twin is also homosexual? And Coleman said that there's 100% concordance in the data, which means if you look at 40 pairs of homosexual or of twins, and if there is one twin who is homosexual in each of these 40 pairs, then it's 100% necessary that the other twin is also going to be homosexual. And this is 1952. This is before Benzer. This is the only genetic study pre-Benzer that existed. Now, post-Benzer's neurogenetics, there was a massive rise in genetic investigations on sexuality. And that's because of several reasons that I've also highlighted in a book chapter that I wrote last year in a book called Sexuality, Objection, and Queer Existence in Contemporary India. But several reasons being, okay, there was a higher availability of model systems, there was a higher availability of genetic tools. But some interesting things arise out of these research. So for example, in 1991, Bailey and Pillard published an attempt to replicate the work that Coleman did. So they again looked at monozygotic twins, and they were again doing the exact same thing that Coleman was doing, but this time they were also looking at, they had dizygotic or fraternal twins as a control, and adopted brothers. So in a family where there's already a child existing and then you sort of adopt another child. So they were also looking at adoptive brothers to see whether the environment has an impact on sexuality. So they had these two controls, and they came up with a number that was particularly interesting. They said that 52% of monozygotic co-twins had this concordance that Coleman said is 100%. Now, basic knowledge of probability tells us that if one were to look at two outcomes, heads and tails, when you toss a coin, the 50% is the number. So if you toss a coin and you do it for 10 times, there's a high possibility that you will have 50% of the times you'll get heads and 50% of times you'll get tails. And the number that Bailey and Pillard found for concomitance is also 52%, which is jarringly close to the number that you're supposed to expect if homosexuality was a chance event. And this was just one of the studies that eventually came to say that homosexuality and its genetics is really complicated. And in 2010, a very interesting study came out which looked at a large number of twins in Sweden and said that male homosexuality at its best is only partly determined by genetics. So genetics may have a role to play in homosexuality, but at its best, it is only a part determination. Then, of course, there was a study in 1993 by Dean Hammer. This was published in Science, where the method that Hammer used is different, which is he looked at X chromosome linkage. So what he was basically tracking is how parts of chromosomes that associate with certain behavior travel across generations. And he said that if one were to do linkage analysis, you would identify a part of the X chromosome, which Hammer called XQ28, Q being the short arm of the X chromosome, a banding pattern in the short arm of the X chromosome. That apparently, according to Hammer, correlates to homosexuality. Again, this study, partly because it was published in Science and partly because it was essentially saying that it has identified the gay gene, created a lot of furor in the science ecosystem, but also outside the science ecosystem. And again, Hammer went ahead and did many such studies over and over again, until in 2019, a Nature paper published so this paper was published in Nature, and what it did is it did this genome-wide association studies, where you basically are looking at the entire genome rather than identifying one or two parts of the chromosome that you're tracking. And it looked at 500,000 genomes. It did similar linkage analysis across the genome and over 500,000 genomes to say that there is no gay gene, there's no possibility of a gay gene. They did find a correlation of 5 DNA markers with homosexuality, but they said that these associations are really poor associations, and these DNA markers that they identified were associated with several other things, including olfaction, gustation, vision, and other things. But more importantly, not one or a combination of these 5 DNA markers had the power to predict the sexuality of an individual. And this study finally put to rest the entire genetics of sexuality line of investigation. And I'm at least really glad that it has done so. But the way we want to approach it, because we are talking about the politics of these research, is the question that queer and trans individuals have always raised. So, for example, Daryl Rist asked that intellectually, what do we gain by finding out there's a homosexual gene? So, even if we were to agree that there is a homosexual gene, what do we gain out of that? And according to Rist, you get nothing except an attempt to identify those people who have it and then open them up to all sorts of experimentation to change them, which is Rist's allusion to conversion therapy. And one must remember that this concern is not misfounded, because on the right, you have a quote that came out from a former chief rabbi who said that homosexuality is a disability, and if people wish to have it eliminated before they have children, because they wish to have grandchildren or for any other reason, I do not see any moral objection to using genetic engineering to limit this particular trend. It would be like correcting many other conditions such as infertility or multiple sclerosis. And at this moment, I also want all of us to recognize how we've always imagined science and religion as two things that are in conflict with each other. But when you think about queer trans individuals or individuals who are otherwise on the margins, science and religion can very well collude to sort of marginalize them more, to eliminate them from social structures. And this is one example where this former chief rabbi, who would have otherwise been very anti genetic engineering, is fine seeing genetic engineering being used to limit what he thinks is a particular trend of homosexuality. And of course, I think Rennie Thomas has done way more interesting work on science and religion and has a lot of more interesting stuff to say about it. But what we also see is that this is not just that science is doing all of this by itself, but the fact that science is colluding with structures of state and civil society to socially and politically marginalize queer and trans individuals. So science, in some sense, is a tool of the state, of the neoliberal capitalist state, of the cis and heteronormative civil society that has been used several times to marginalize queer and trans people. And an example of that I'll be using to sort of substantiate my point is how science has been used to approach pandemics. And the pandemic that I want to look at is the HIV/AIDS pandemic, because it's been one of the moments when this tension between queer trans individuals and science has become more visible, more articulate, and the fact that the HIV/AIDS movement was also one of the very important junctures where one could articulate queer and trans identities visibly. So, for example, what you see is the NACP3, the National AIDS Control Program 3 operational guidelines. And what you see is something interesting, which is that there are three broad populations that the NACP3 operational guidelines is defining. There's a key population, then there's a bridge population, and there's a general population. The key population, according to the NACP3, included female sex workers, men having sex with men, migrant workers, truck and auto drivers. So 4 heavily marginalized groups. The general population was everybody else, and the bridge population were people who were sort of spreading the disease from the key population to the general population. Now, one thing that was pointed out quite early, as one looked at how these categories were created, is to say that these categories were already very arbitrary. it is telling us that, oh, the interaction between general population and key population is happening only through the bridge population, which eventually people have shown is not true. The general population and the key population are not as distinctly marked as the NSCP3 guidelines would imagine them to be. But what I find interesting about this figure is how the general population has been kept in the periphery, the key population kept in the center, while the intention of this figure is to say the bang opposite, which is the concerns of the general population, which is to be safe from disease and death, have to be at the center, and the key population, the marginalized population, is the one that should be isolated, intervened into, and if possible, eliminated. And and we know that the HIV/AIDS movement was used by the state to intervene into the lives of sex workers and queer and trans individuals, isolate them, subject them to all forms of violence. This has been very well documented. But what I also want you to pay attention to is how science became a tool for the state to construct gender and sexual identities. So what you see is this very interesting graph that comes from NSCP3 operational guidelines, and where NSCP3 is talking about which are the populations that require targeted intervention and which are the populations that do not. So on the y-axis, you have targeted intervention groups and non-targeted intervention groups. And on the x-axis, you have from the right to left the sex act that the NSCP3 is looking at. So whether the population is anal penetrator, anal receptor and penetrator, and anal receptor. And then you see that it's saying something like regular partners of kotis. So, okay, some of these terms. So kotis are a cultural and social trans feminine identity. Panthis are their partners, hijras and transgender persons. The TGs is for transgenders, but we know that the accurate term is transgender persons, are trans identities. And then double deckers are people who are apparently both anal receptors and penetrators, and then there are male sex workers. So just look at how the graph is making these clear categories by saying that, okay, kotis do not need kotis need targeted intervention, hijras and transgender person need targeted intervention because they are anal receptors. The problem with that discourse is, A, it leaves out several other people who are at a high risk of HIV/AIDS and needed targeted intervention at that point of time. But more importantly, sociologically, what it is doing is that it is bringing these really intriguing and really diverse gender and sexual identities, narrowing them down and boxing them into clear-cut sexual acts, as if the existence of queer and trans individuals is the sex act that they perform, and there's nothing more to being queer and trans. And the state used science as a tool to do this, and scientists and doctors were happy to collude. I'm almost at the end of my talk. I want to finally think a little bit more about why is this politics that we've been talking about for all this while not discussed in classrooms, and how do science classrooms and scientists convince themselves and others that these questions are not questions that they should be engaging with. And one example that has come out from the research that I'm currently pursuing, the manuscript is in preparation, is the scene that's occurring in a science classroom. It's a biology research methodology classroom, where the research methodology teacher is saying that there are only two genders. Now, any biologist hopefully will agree that this is a wrong statement to make, because across the natural world, we have several examples that tell us that any imagination of gender that's binary is now flawed. But anyway, so my interlocutor, the participant called D, sort of decides to counter the research methodology teacher and says that, no, ma'am, when you say two genders, that's erasure. There are other identities that are out there. And the teacher gives a very interesting response. The teacher says, no, according to me, and you must pay attention to according to me. There are only two genders. Anything else is deviant. What you're talking about is called sociology, and life sciences does not accommodate parameters like gender and sexuality. We don't do that here. Now, this quote is interesting in many ways. The first one being according to me, because science has kept on telling us that scientific facts are not dependent on the person. And if there are only two genders, then it should not be according to the research methodology teacher at all. But so you do see that there's a certain amount of subjectivity that scientists and science educators bring into the conversation. But more importantly, how is this idea of the deviant being constructed, the deviant of anything outside the gender binary being constructed? And it is by saying that, okay, this is not a concern of science, it is a concern of sociology. Life sciences does not accommodate parameters like gender and sexuality. So what you will see is that the teacher is using the word sociology to say that these concerns are concerns of the deviant and therefore unimportant. This is something that a science classroom does not need to engage with. And this is becoming the way in which the teacher can say that, okay, science is the study of the normal and therefore the study of the important. So this is one way that depoliticization happens, and especially depoliticization of conversations around gender and sexuality in science classrooms happen, where science sort of insulates itself from concerns like this, because then it will have to enter into questions of ethics. It will have to enter into questions where it has to start analyzing power and also sort of think about how it is producing and reproducing power. And I want to finally end by what I promised in the title of the talk, which is how does one put the political back in science? And for this, I'd like to use the example, the case study of a trans collective in an Indian science institution, where I've been doing some fieldwork over the past couple of months. So this trans collective that we are talking about started as a temporary group during the Trans Awareness Week in 2021. This institution already had a larger queer collective, which was not very active. So then the trans people decided to take matter into their own hands and sort of separate out as a different group. And now this group has attained a more permanent structure and is more active than the larger queer collective. Now, some interesting things about this group, in my observation, is that the collective is open to trans people on other campuses in the city as well. And members of this collective offer support and intervene when trans persons outside the campus face a physical or mental crisis. And it is because this collective exists in this campus that trans people who are not affiliated with the institution can come inside this campus, which is otherwise safeguarded and has like a really big wall covering it, sort of, surrounding it all over. And the first interesting observation for me comes from there, which is that the presence of this trans collective is making the boundaries of this institution porous. It is, we've been talking, we always talk about how science institutions are silos and inaccessible. The question of access becomes very interesting to look at when one realizes that the existence of such collectives, which are collectives of people coming from the margins, gender marginal groups, how they make these boundaries porous. And then some other interesting things that this collective has been able to do is, for example, burn the Manusmriti on campus every year on the Manusmriti Dahan Divas, which is also incidentally Christmas. So 25th of December is when Dr. B.R. Ambedkar burnt the Manusmriti. It coincides with Christmas, and the trans collective took initiative to do this in an institute which is the bastion of Brahminism, to the point that the institute is called an Iyer Iyengar Institute. Moreover, the trans collective was also at the helm for raising concerns about a dysfunctional SC/ST cell on campus. And for me, as a queer trans individual who's been studying and engaging with discourses on gender and caste, this became a very interesting example of what Dalit trans activists have been calling Dalit trans solidarity. So for example, Living Smile Vidya has spoken about how transphobia is a type of Brahminism. And then G. Iman Semalar has spoken about how trans people have found support in Dalit colonies. Despite facing transphobia from Dalit individuals, it is in these spaces that they thrive the most. And also how Grace Banu has spoken about our fight against transphobia and casteism being both a fight with the larger civil society, but a fight with our own um, communities. And I think the collective that we've been talking about manages to bring together the idea of Dalit trans solidarity in very interesting ways, and engages in political activities on campus, like burning the Manusmriti in the bastion of Brahmanism. And since then they've also put up posters about gender neutral washrooms and gender neutral accommodation on campus. So what they're basically doing is they're making rights based political demands from the administration. And therefore, what I want to say is that collectivization of the marginalized is crucial in science institutions to bring the political back into science. And this collectivization is itself something that science institutions have heavily resisted. And there are several ways in which the science institutions have resisted, which would be through the culture of overwork, through taking an apolitical identity, and through what Geeta Chadha calls the theatrics of brilliance. And we can talk more about it if there are questions. And finally, and I'm sorry, I think I'm at time, but finally, this is my last slide, and I want to end by making a comment on science education. And I want to draw from an article that Professor Panchapakeshan, who's now retired from Delhi University, made about a case for scientific temper through social science education in science institutions. And this was in the background of a march for science that happened, and then several scholars got into an argument with each other about this march for science and the larger discourse of scientific temper. And what Panchapakeshan says is that scientific temper has very little to do with researching as a scientist. So it involves looking at a problem, considering the various options, and deciding what to do. So it is essentially a psychological state of mind. And science teaching, according to Panchapakeshan, is inherently anti-scientific temper because it follows the transmission model of education where accepted ideas and facts are transmitted from a teacher to student, and such education is not very good at presenting alternatives and raising critical discussions. And Panchapakeshan says that it is social science which helps in being more critical, making suitable choices and cultivating scientific temper. And therefore, I am with Panchapakeshan to say that it is crucial that science education in science institutions accommodate and actively engage with questions and critiques that have come out from the social sciences and the humanities, and inculcate social science education in their science curricula. With that, I have a couple of acknowledgements to make. The names are on the slide, and I'm happy to take questions if any.
Thanks, Sayantan. I think, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Right.
I think the talk was, I think, something that yeah, it's better to have it in institution like ISL Pune, which is supposed to be, a bastion of tomorrow's science. So, okay, there are a few questions in the chat box. I'll read them out to you. So, Akash is asking if you could talk a little bit more about when you said, quote by Vidya, saying transphobia is a type of Brahmin.
Oh, so what the way Vidya articulates it is to say that how things like untouchability, for example, function. So transgender persons, especially working class transgender persons, have essentially two occupations in the country that they can take, one being sex work and the other being begging. And it is through sex work and begging, by sort of saying that these are dirty occupations, that transgender persons are also called dirty and therefore untouchables. And you see something like this happening in how caste has been constructed, which is that certain quote unquote dirty occupations have been reserved for certain marginalized caste groups, and it is through these dirty occupations that their caste is being articulated as dirty, and they are therefore deemed untouchable.
Right. So there was a question earlier in the talk by Akash, where I think they wanted to ask about the data that you showed about that was segregated by gender and then by caste. So they had a question if the data about caste was also segregated according to subjects. So like if biology has a certain prevalence for, the proportions are according to caste also if there are some.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't come across that data, but I don't know. I think, Rennie, have you come across such data if you're here and you're able to answer? But I haven't come across data that's been done that way. But I think several groups are trying to file RTIs now, and we might have some of that data come um, eventually. But the point is that it doesn't matter. I mean, whether you have data that is discipline disaggregated or not, doesn't matter. The reason being that what do you do when the culture and nature of an institution itself is casteist and gendered? So I think there's a great amount of work that's been done to show that science institutions are architecturally constructed often as gendered. So for example, if one were to go to IIT Bombay, the first ladies hostel, I mean, it was called ladies hostel, which in the late 1970s, after women students protested, became students hostel 10. That was the only hostel that was directly opposite to the director's bungalow, while all other students hostels which were housing men were situated closer to the academic block and closer to where all the fun on the campus was. And these women were made to be direct surveillees of the director. So there's an architect. So there's a very interesting book that Chainika Shah has edited called Space Segregation Discrimination, where we know that architecturally some of these institutions are gendered. We know that culturally some of these institutions are casteist. So then how does having that, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the numbers themselves are only a starting point for us in some sense to start these conversations. But I think the problem is much deeper. I mean, think about architecture itself as being casteist, right? I mean, so in Bombay, for example, Dalit Bahujan colonies that were previously slums were replaced by these. So, those slums were demolished, and the people who were living there were given. So, a flat was built there, a big housing complex was built, and then one flat was given to each of the families that were inhabiting in that slum. And now when architecture scholars have gone and looked at those buildings, these are buildings that have been purposefully made in a way that sunlight doesn't enter, you cannot utilize maximum space. So caste and casteism are embedded in the disciplines and how the disciplines work. So I don't think having that added number is very helpful. We really need to think about it. What I've been trying to see, what is the ideology that's in science and what are the politics in science? How is power and ideology dictating what science is and how science is done?
If someone from the online audience has a question, they can type it in the chat.
Yeah, I've been seeing that. I think this is about the correlation figure about how much of sexuality is genetically determined. And so, I mean, I think the response that Akash has given is pretty much quite clarifying. But I must also say that these numbers are really interesting. So, I mean, I showed you two studies, but if you were to look at, I don't know, at least 30 such studies have been done on different kinds of twins and in different countries in different ways. You see that these numbers can literally be anything. You say a number and you'll probably find it in one of these papers. But once again, the point being that what is this number letting you do? What is being able to say something like sexuality is genetic or sexuality is not genetic letting you do? So saying something like sexuality is genetic can have two consequences. One, you can say it is not a choice and it is natural. And for that, you don't need to do genetics. If you were to step into the natural world and you were to look at organisms and animals and plants, you would already find that homosexuality and any kind of gender and sexual variation that you can imagine is already present in the natural world. You do not need genetic investigation to prove that at all. And if you were to say sexuality is not genetic, then, I mean, why even do that? Why has that field of research continued for so long? And if I don't know if some of you are Drosophila biologists, then you might be familiar with two fruit fly mutants, fruitless and double sex, that were sort of the favorite of Drosophila biologists for so long that even Jeffrey Hall, the Nobel Prize winner, worked on fruitless for a significant part of time. And fruitless is a mutant that showed quote unquote homosexual behavior, where mature males, so some of the alleles of fruitless showed this, not all alleles of fruitless. And double sexes also showed what they called bisexual behavior. Some alleles of double sex fruit flies show bisexual behavior. And research on fruit flies continued for a good 40 years when it was clearly known. And I mean, even now, fruitless and double sex are very sort of hot mutants, and people work on them all the time to talk about sexual circuitry and all that. Knowing since the mutant was discovered that these two genes have no orthologs in human beings. You've not been able to find fruitless and double sex orthologs in human beings at all. So that brings me back to the point of ideology. There's a certain reason why scientists are doing it, and I don't think this reason is innocent curiosity. It is a certain desire to bring sexuality down to genetics and be able to control and intervene into queer and trans lives, that this is all a part of. And whether scientists, individual scientists, recognize it or not, I mean, when we are talking about science, we are not talking about individual scientists, we are also talking about science as a system and as a subculture. It has all the classic markers of a subculture and a system. So we're talking about science in that sense. So irrespective of whether I am casteist or not as a scientist, there's a high possibility I'm a part of casteism in science. Yeah, I hope that clarifies these questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Kritika has a question: is as an environmental science educator for middle school students, are there any resources you can recommend to engage with students?
Okay. That's a tough one, but if you don't mind, do you mind writing to me on my email, and that gives me some time to check out if I know of any resources, but I can also connect you to other people who might have better resources to provide. Environment is one of the things that I read very layly, and I don't think I have a lot to say there, but let me try to think about it.
I think you can also because I know Sayantan is also very active on Twitter, so I think you can also reach out to Sayantan where you can.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Karthik has a question: is the new generation private university is more non-binary friendly?
Yeah, so I'll give you the my answer to that, Karthik, is that from what I have heard from talking to queer and trans individuals in these private universities, and I'm assuming when you say new generation, you mean these liberal arts universities specifically. So in my understanding at the moment, trans and queer individuals in these institutions definitely feel that they are more friendly, non-binary and trans friendly than traditional public university setups. And I'm currently in the process of understanding why that is so. But some early thoughts that I have is that that the constituency that comes to these liberal arts universities is a very woke, upper caste, elite, urban constituency, which means they have already been, in some or the other sense, introduced to questions of gender and sexuality. So it is taking care of, at least at the optics level. So I don't know if any affirmative action is happening for these individuals there at all, but at least at the scale of sheer optics, there appears to be less discrimination. And then I think negotiating some of the low hanging fruits like gender neutral hostels and gender neutral washrooms has been significantly easier in these neoliberal private universities, because of the fact that they have a corporate side to them. And pinkwashing and LGBT politics is literally the favorite topic of corporate spaces, and there's a lot that's been written and spoken about it. So I think that's reasons, but also the fact that some of us exist in these neoliberal liberal arts private universities, trans faculty ourselves, who have the safety and the space now to come out and in these private universities and negotiate some of these things. So for example, Ashoka has Bittu Rajaraman, I and there's another colleague at Krea. So I think it's a combination of multiple factors at this moment. These are early thoughts that are emerging from the work that I'm doing. Yeah, but I think I'll have, towards the end of this year, I might have more things to say to you. But yeah, I think, Karthik, I mean, the simple answer is yes on the face of it.
Ash has an interesting question. The study that you mentioned in the end of where you said, talking about in classrooms. So he has a question that whether it is for schools or whether it is for higher education.
Sorry, I didn't follow the question.
Right, sir. Okay. So the final study you discussed with regard to social science education, bolstering the development of scientific temper, was that in context of schools or higher education? And whichever it is, do you think the results are likely to generalize to the other case?
So, I mean, I think Panchapacation is definitely talking about higher education, because in school, at least till class 10, you are studying social sciences along with the sciences. Although, of course, you're being told that if you are a smart student and an intelligent student and a CGPA 10 holder, you should go and do science. But the question is whether this is generalizable or not. I mean, whether even in class 11 and 12, let's say, students should be introduced to social science education. I think certainly yes. So see, I mean, you don't need to say that today you're going to study history and tomorrow you're going to study physics. You can also study history of physics, and there are many interesting things that are happening there. What is important, why you want to study the social science, and why do you want to study social sciences commentary on science, is because it helps you understand where science has gone wrong and do better science. I mean, all of this discussion is not to eventually say we are anti-science individuals who have some kind of anger against science and we've not been able to complete our PhDs in sciences and hence are lashing out. I mean, these are things that have been told to me, but the point being to say that if you want to be a better scientist, you better know your history and you better know the potential that your field has. See, I mean, when I go and ask scientists, about whether they think that the kind of work that they are doing can cause harm or not, scientists will say, it's like a knife and all that argument that we began with. And they'll say, how do I know in the future how my work will be used? But when you're filing grant applications, you are already writing how you imagine your work is going to be used. You're talking about what you want to do with your work and what you expect the world to do with your work. So I'm going to attach a fluorophore to a new molecule, but you're also saying that in the future, this is going to be used to detect cancer and detect this and detect that. I mean, these are examples that are coming from the top of my head, which means you are thinking about the future application of your research already. but you're making a selective choice to not think about the violent and harmful future applications of your research, which I think is choosing, like, epistemologically choosing and working with epistemologies which has an ideology and politics to it. You'd rather feel safe. When I say you, I mean we. So we all would rather feel safe knowing that we didn't do it with a bad intention. But it's not a question of intention at all, especially when you're in a system.
It's true. It's kind of sort of like dissociating from your own actions so that you don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, and this disassociation is one of the markers of science, right? It's
Yeah.
called philosophers call this disinterestedness, but science is always telling you to be objective, and the way you want to be objective is to say that dissociate yourself from all kind of value laden systems. So don't have empathy, don't have emotion, look at it as an object that you're going to study and collect data that is going to be replicable and falsifiable. So disinterestedness is a marker of science, and it is not surprising at all to say that this. What is important to remember is that this disinterestedness is political. There's an ideological and political grounding to this disinterestedness itself, and the ideological grounding is that it allows you to not engage with questions of ethics.
Right. So we have an audience from Faisal Kolkata as well. Hi, Arume. So they have a question about the gay brain drain that is happening in Indian academia, and do you expect it? How do you expect it to proceed in the near future?
Okay, I don't think I'm the best person to answer this question, partly because I don't know if there's like enough evidence for us to say that there's a particular gay brain drain happening. What we do know is that a lot of queer individuals who have the caste and class privilege to exit the country are choosing to go to America, or US or the UK or other countries to pursue their higher education. That said, there's a significant number, a very large number of queer and trans individuals who just don't have the privilege and are therefore staying in the country. Now, how is it going to look in the future? No idea. But we do know that why this brain drain, if at all it's happening, is happening, right? It is happening because our science institutions have not responded to our demands and to our concerns, have not engaged with our concerns at all. So then, would you rather be on a campus for 5 to 10 years of your life facing immense homo and transphobia, and having to live double lives and so on and so forth, or would you go to the Americas and live a better life? So now, how would it look in the future? I don't think I can comment on that.
Right. So just me as a question. So I won't read the complete part, but I think the point of a question is that looking for a particular gay gene seems to be a very, just a scientific question rather than having some malevolent behavior behind it. I think, but from just if I can add to that, just Neil, is that I think the whole point that Sayantan has been trying to say is that it, on the face of it, it looks very rather what he calls, curiosity, but it has its own within a system. It has end goals which are eventually has the potential to be used very malevolently against the community. But I think Sayantan can respond.
No, so I think it's important to recognize whether actually scientists are studying all aspects of human behavior or not. It's interesting that scientists have never studied heterosexuality. I'm happy to be told of one paper where scientists have studied heterosexuality. They haven't. They have only studied homosexuality. I'm happy to see one paper where scientists have studied uh, cisgender. Why is it that assigned male at birth people identify as men in the future? But there are tens of thousands of papers that have studied quote unquote transgenderism. So it is very clear that scientists are not studying all aspects of human behavior equally at all. Scientists are not studying why scientists are castists. How is it that ISRO directors can go to uh, Shiv temples and give, all that puja and stuff before they launch a rocket into space? I mean, you're launching a rocket into space, you want to conquer the universe, and on the other hand, you think that Shivalingam is going to give you something. So scientists are not studying that. It is people like Rennie Thomas who are studying this. It is social scientists who are studying it. So scientists are certainly not studying all aspects of human behavior. And then one must think more critically about why scientists are choosing to study some human behavior over others.
I hope that answers Chesley's question. I think that was a very fair response. So, if there are no more questions from here, our audience as well, I would like to thank Sayantan for giving this talk. I think this was a very good talk, and especially the last part of your talk, I feel was very, very instructive, because I hope something like that can happen in ISAPUME as well. Thank you, Sayantan. We'll stop the recording now. If we wish to have an informal discussion for 5 to 10 minutes, we'll just have that.
Sure.
Yeah.